The TLDR, I think, is what Saylor showed is that there's this giant pool of capital in the debt markets, and you can go tap the debt markets and borrow at 0, 5, 10% with some duration, and then turn around and buy an asset that goes up a lot more than 5% a year. And if you can make that debt long duration enough and with the right terms, there's a huge arbitrage basically in the capital markets, and you can then turn that flywheel. And then the market started saying, well, if you're going to turn this flywheel and you're just going to keep stacking 2, 3, 4, 5x more Bitcoin per share, I'll just front run you. Even though you have $1 of Bitcoin on the balance sheet, I'll make you worth $2. And so everybody looks at that and says, wait a second, this is just a capital markets arbitrage. And I think setting aside any value judgments, I think these things, they are what they are. Like, the capital markets exist the way that they do, and people arbitrage them. And like, if this is going to exist, between debt and equity markets, and people can turn that crank, people are going to turn the crank. It's just sort of, it is what it is. I think the most interesting question here is, like, how long does it last, and is any of it actually durable? And I think the analogies to the ICO markets are very apt. I think this is kind of like the ICO, cycle. There's a bunch of capital that comes in. Most of it doesn't get anywhere, but actually, we got Ethereum out of the ICO cycle, right? You got a $500 billion asset that has had a transformative impact, right? So I don't think it's fair to say this is all bad. Like, I think there are going to be implementations of this that I think are really interesting. And so my take is, actually, I think probably for Bitcoin, probably for ETH, maybe for Solana, I think there's an argument that these things will persist actually on the other side in a very, very meaningful way. Some of the longer tail assets, I think, is going to be very hit or miss. Some of them are clearly going to not be around, and some of them, I think, actually have a shot at being around because the exposure into a new capital market is sort of like front runs an ETF. And so if you can't get an ETF, this is actually a way for other parts of the capital markets to get exposure to your thing. And if your thing is actually like fundamentally useful, then I think it has a shot. But I think if we restrict it just to the BTC ETH Sol, I think what happens is, our base case is that likely there's a run, right? These things basically behave like levered exposure for a while. And then it pulls back hard. And when the inevitable crypto pullback comes, these things probably end up, it's like GBTC. It'll sort of pull back, and it very likely pulls back below NAV rather than being a 2x. And when it pulls back, that's when there's like interesting opportunities, actually. And if you're long-term minded, I think some of these guys who are long-term minded and smart, like I think Joe, we participated in SBET with Joe Lubin, for example. And, I think it's entirely possible that Joe goes out and says, I'll just roll up a bunch of other ones, or the ETHZilla team could go out and roll up a bunch of other ones in this sort of the cycle. And then you get to the other side of that cycle. That's where I think it's really interesting. So I think if you're able to pull off a Bitcoin treasury or an ETH treasury or a Sol treasury, and you have some fundamental yield, and you think these assets are actually worth 10x what they're worth today, you play that out. And I think the long game, if you're long-term minded, is, do you end up with an asset with, let's say, $30 billion of notional, right? Like, if you get $3, $4, $5 billion of ETH today, does it 10x? You end up with 30, 40, $50 billion of notional. That thing's generating staking yield and other yield in DeFi. Could you make $1 billion a year in free cash flow with basically like 10 people? That's a pretty monster business. That starts to look like a Berkshire style business, right? It's like a really small team that just spins cash. So I don't know. I think there's an argument that in the long term, these things are actually very interesting if done right. And it's just going to be messy in the middle for a while.